Hello and welcome to this lecture on Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. In this lecture, we'll talk about the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 and his policy agenda meant to address the suffering, conditions, and economic catastrophe of the Great Depression. These programs are known collectively as the New Deal. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about Roosevelt himself. Okay, because Roosevelt will be our longest serving president. He will be elected to 4 terms. Remember, in the original Constitution, there are no term limits for the presidency. And so the only governing principle was the precedent set by Washington that one should only serve 2 terms. But there was nothing legally or constitutionally preventing a president from serving more. Franklin Roosevelt ended up serving 3 full terms, and he was just starting his 4th term when he passed away in April of 1945. So the events that we're going to be talking about in this lecture with respect to the Great Depression, and in the next lecture with respect to World War II, Franklin Roosevelt will be the president. It will be his administration. Roosevelt came from a wealthy, affluent background. He came from a family, the same family as Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt were distant cousins. So he came from an affluent family and one whose name was politically famous because of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt himself was very well educated. He'd gone to Harvard and had attended Columbia Law School before dropping out because he'd already passed the bar exam. He was a practicing lawyer. He had served in New York state politics because he's from the state of New York. That's where the Roosevelt family was from. He had been in New York state politics, in the New York state legislature. He had been in the Woodrow Wilson administration. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. And he had been the vice presidential nominee in 1920 in an election that the Democrats lost to Warren G. Harding. So he was a person with a lot of political experience. Now, Roosevelt Roosevelt continued to be involved in politics after being on the losing ticket of the 1920 election. In 1928 and 1930, he was elected to be governor of New York and was serving as governor of New York when he ran for president in 1932. So Franklin Roosevelt was from a wealthy, affluent background, and had enormous political experience before he came into office. Let's talk a little bit about the election of 1932, now that you know a little bit about Franklin Roosevelt. The election of 1932 pits Roosevelt against Hoover. We've talked about Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was a traditional Republican. He believed in laissez-faire economics and laissez-faire capitalism. We talked about how he did not believe in government intervention in the economy, and if government was going to spend money on the economy, it must then balance the budget by cutting spending elsewhere. And in doing so, basically negating the effects of the spending. If you're going to spend in one area and cut the other, then you're not really increasing spending, and it sort of negates it. Hoover fervently believed that as bad as the Depression was, that it would be over soon, and that it would be detrimental to the country and the economy for government to assume a larger role. By contrast, Franklin Roosevelt felt the opposite. He felt that the government needed to take action. Remember, Roosevelt served in the Wilson administration. Roosevelt believed in the ideals of the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era believed that government had a responsibility to regulate the economy and to regulate business and to ensure that workers and the common people benefited, or at the very least were not exploited by the economy. So Roosevelt had a different opinion. Roosevelt, as governor of New York, had overseen several programs that are attempted to address the inequities and the suffering of the Depression. So when we get to the election of 1932, Herbert Hoover is offering simply more of the same. Hoover is offering more and more of the same kinds of solutions, which is that stay the course, the economy will rebound, government has no role here, and that people just need to work hard and endure, and the worst will be over. FDR, by contrast, is projecting confidence and strength and hope. FDR is promising Americans a brighter future. He is promising Americans government action. He's promising Americans something called a New Deal. Now, Roosevelt is being very cagey and guarded about what it is that he intends to propose to solve the Depression. If you go back and look at Roosevelt's campaign information, if you read Roosevelt's speeches from the campaign of 1932, you will see that Roosevelt never gets into specifics. He never tells you exactly what his New Deal programs are going to look like. He never gives a specific piece of legislation or a specific law or specific policy. Instead, he offers Americans government action. He says that government has a responsibility to do something, and he suggests that it's within government's power to help ease the Depression. He also is attacking the policies of Hoover. He's attacking the system itself, which he believes is failing people, and he is simply offering the American public a confidence that something is possible that Hoover is not. In one of his most famous speeches, Roosevelt will say, "There is nothing to fear but fear itself." Now, if you analyze that line with any kind of critical eye, it looks like a line that isn't really saying much. It looks almost nonsensical. But if you dig deeper into what Roosevelt is trying to convey to the American public, what he's saying is that the only thing we should fear is our own fears that keep us from acting, our fears that keep us from imagining the possible, from imagining what we could do. What Roosevelt is saying, don't be afraid of trying new things. Don't be afraid of innovating. In another speech, Roosevelt says, inevitably, we need to try things. Inevitably, we're going to get things wrong. And then we recalibrate and we try again. And of course, those are not direct quotes. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's just another famous speech. He's not saying that he is the wise man with all the answers. He's saying he's the person with the vision for what could be done. In addition to offering hope and strength and assurances to the American public, Roosevelt is a master of political communication and political imagery. Roosevelt is taking advantage of the new medium of the day, and that new medium is radio. Radio had been around since the 1920s, but by 1932, radio technology was affordable that even during the Depression, many Americans could have a radio in their home. And that radio was usually put in the family room, sometimes like above the fireplace. And the radio was the entertainment vehicle of the day. Radio was where you listened to music. Radio is where you had radio dramas. And these radio dramas might be soap operas, they might be readings of like famous stories or famous pieces of literature, or they could be original programming, detective stories and comedy shows and so on and so forth. And then radio was also how news was delivered. And so radio was kind of your entertainment, your information, your music all rolled up in one. And Roosevelt was famous for his use of radio. And the big advantage of radio was it got beyond the reporters. In some ways, reporters and newspapers could be gatekeepers to your message. They would report on your speeches, but they would summarize them and they would analyze them. And you never knew how they might filter your message. What radio allowed Roosevelt to do was get beyond them and speak directly to the people and let people make their own judgments about what he was saying, what he was proposing, what he was offering. And he found this was such an effective medium that he continued doing it all throughout his presidency and his other campaigns. These became famously known as the fireside chats because the radio was often placed above the fire and people would gather in the living room with a fire roaring and listen to Roosevelt speak on the radio. And it was like he was at your own fireside, and that's how they got to be known as the fireside chats. And you can find lots of images of Roosevelt sitting behind broadcast microphones having his message delivered to the American public with his fireside chat. So it's one of the more famous aspects of Roosevelt's communication strategy, if you will. The other way in which Roosevelt was kind of a master of political imagery was in his own personal image. What was not widely known in 1932, but certainly will be by the mid-1930s, but was not widely known in 1932 is Roosevelt's physical limitations. In 1921, in the summer of 1921, Franklin Roosevelt suffered a mysterious illness. At the time, it was put down as a form of polio, but today we're not exactly sure. But this mysterious illness resulted in fever and all sorts of organ problems, but its most visible feature and legacy was paralysis. That this illness caused the onset of paralysis in Roosevelt from kind of the waist down. And after 1921, Roosevelt never regained the feeling within his legs. He survives the illness, but he is paralyzed from the waist down. Now, Roosevelt will learn to stand and even to walk limited distances with the help of these metal braces, but for the most part, he is in a wheelchair. Now, at the time, in the 1920s, many Americans did not have very accommodating, inclusive, or enlightened views about physical disabilities. And so Roosevelt was very concerned that his inability to walk and the fact that he was in a wheelchair might be a barrier to his political ambitions and his desire for higher political office. And so Roosevelt often hid his physical limitations to the public. Oftentimes when he'd give a speech in public, he would have his braces on and he would give it from the podium so that they would see him standing and giving his speech. And Roosevelt would make sure that he wasn't seen in his wheelchair until he was kind of backstage or away from public view. And during the election of 1932, he actually struck kind of an agreement, a gentleman's agreement, a kind of an informal agreement, if you will, with the press, in which he would give them access, he would pose for photos, he would make sure that they got the stories they needed and the access they needed in exchange for them not photographing him in his wheelchair during the election. And so the press all knew about the legacy and the consequences of his illness, but it wasn't widely known in the public. Now, after Roosevelt's elected, by the mid to late 1930s, it becomes very well known that he is in a wheelchair, and it doesn't seem to have had any impact on his popularity and his standing within the American public. But at the day, he sort of wanted to project strength in a way that he was concerned that his physical limitations, given the prejudices of the day, would not convey. So, in the election of 1932, we have Herbert Hoover, who represents the establishment, the traditional Republican view, and is offering more of the same, which America has already experienced for the last 3 years. Roosevelt is not being very specific, but he's promising action, and he's saying that the promise of government action would lead to the hope that the Depression could be alleviated. Roosevelt wins this election in a landslide. So Roosevelt takes office. Now he's got to fulfill his grand promises, his bold ambitions. He's got to make good on his New Deal, okay? He's got to make good on his New Deal. And Roosevelt will engage in one of the most revolutionary periods of legislation in American history. It's known as his first 100 days, in which he rolls out program after program after program after program. Now, he's assisted by huge Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate. The Democrats have huge congressional majorities that allow him to get legislation through Congress rapidly. Now, collectively, this is known as the New Deal. If you were to take a class focusing specifically on the Great Depression or on the Roosevelt administration or on the New Deal, you would go in more detail and talk about the sequencing and what happened in the first 100 days, what happened in 1935, what happened after 1936, because all of that is very, very important. In a survey class, we're not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk about Roosevelt's programs for the entirety of the New Deal era. So from 1933 to say 1940, okay? So I'm going to talk about his programs that are rolled out over a 7-year period, okay? Over a 7-year period. I'm not going to break them down chronologically. Instead, I'm going to do them thematically. So in other words, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down the New Deal by thematic part of the economy. What part of the economy were they trying to address, and what programs did they create to address those issues? So the goal here is to handle this in a broad section, looking at their thematic impact on the economy itself. I'm not going to try and do this chronologically, okay? So this is just going to be a broad overview of the major New Deal policies with respect to the area of the economy that they were attempting to address, or the part of society they were attempting to address, okay? So that's how we're going to handle this. Now, before we get going, you need to understand that the New Deal itself was based primarily on the economic ideas of a British economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes is spelled Keynes. John Maynard Keynes. Now, John Maynard Keynes was a British economist who had a pretty radical and revolutionary approach to the economy. John Maynard Keynes rejected traditional economic theory. He rejected the traditional laissez-faire approach to capitalism and the economy. He thought it was wrong. It was flawed. Keynes believed that government should intervene in the economy and was required to intervene in the economy to ensure that the economy grew for the benefit of the country's population as a whole. So what John Maynard Keynes basically thought is that when the economy is growing, it is government's responsibility to ensure that it grows in a way that is sustainable and is not exploitative of workers. By contrast, when the economy is in decline, like during a depression, John Maynard Keynes believed that government could intervene to solve that depression through government programs and government spending. You see, John Maynard Keynes understood that the basic problem of an economy when it was in recession is that the market wasn't functioning properly. That one of two things or both things of a market were going wrong. So in a basic sense, economic markets run on the principle of supply and demand. You have the supply of something, like say food or clothing or whatever. There's supply of an economic industry. And then you have the demand for it. And supply and demand are what create the market. It's what creates the economy. When there's supply of something and demand for it, then prices are created and people buy and sell goods. When an economy is in depression, you can have all sorts of things about supply and demand that go out of whack. You can have a lot of supply but no demand. You can have a lot of demand but no supply. You can have a lot of supply and a lot of demand, but because no one has jobs, they can't actually buy anything. And John Maynard Keynes said this is where governments can really intervene in the economy. They can provide demand for goods to get industries going, or they can encourage supplies to get industries going, or they can spend money to get people jobs so they can buy supply and generate demand. In other words, what John Maynard Keynes was saying, governments need not be passive in the economy. They can spend money and put that money into the economy to get it going when the economy needs help. And it was that basic principle that's behind the New Deal. The New Deal is going to be a wide-ranging series of programs that do government regulation to ensure that industries either don't exploit workers or don't engage in activities that are dangerous to the economy as a whole. Roosevelt, the New Deal is going to spend money, put money into the economy in the hopes that putting that money into the economy gets businesses going again and gets workers working again and gets money being generated. The New Deal is also going to try and help bolster prices for goods where prices have collapsed, and also help regulate supply when there's oversupply. All of these are based on the ideas of John Maynard Keynes that what you can do is intervene in a way to try and address economic suffering. And this is what Roosevelt's New Deal is about. It's about programs designed to regulate, to spend, or to try and jumpstart the economy. And so as I mentioned earlier, what they basically did is they broke the economy into sectors and then designed programs to address each sector. And I think it's important that we understand each of these because they will be significant later on in American history. So one of the first things that Roosevelt needed to do was stabilize the finance or banking sector. We talked about in the previous lecture how the banking system caused so many problems that both led to the Depression and made the Depression worse. And so Roosevelt realized that they needed to stabilize the banks. They needed the public to be confident in the banks again, that they could put their money with the banks so that the banks had capital to start loan projects. But in order to get that, they knew that people needed to be confident if they put their money with the banks again, that they wouldn't lose them. Because remember, banks lost people's money. They lost their life savings at the start of the Depression. So Roosevelt needs to return confidence to the banking industry. Now, once he gets confidence in the banking industry, then what he needs to do is ensure that the banking industry does not behave so irresponsibly that they engage in activity that could harm the economy again. Because economists at the time, and they were right, correctly identified that the banks had played a major role in bringing the economy down. They'd engaged in activity that was so risky that it was going to fail at some point, and when it did so, it failed with catastrophic ramifications. So they need to regulate the banks to make sure they can't engage in that activity again in order to ensure that the banking industry does not contribute to a collapse like this in the future. So it's a very big task. So the Roosevelt administration does a few major things. The first thing that they do is they declare a bank holiday. Roosevelt comes into office in March because back then the Constitution said that you were elected in November but came to office in March. So when he comes to office in March, one of the first things he does is he declares a bank holiday. He closes the banks for several days. The idea is to close all the banks, shut them down, and then you're going to reopen them. When you reopen them, you're reopening them in a way to put them on better financial footing. When he closes the banks, he orders the Federal Reserve, or he authorizes the Federal Reserve to make billions of dollars available to the banks for them to borrow. Now, the Federal Reserve, if you recall, was created in the Progressive era. The Federal Reserve is effectively the nation's central bank. It's the depository for our tax revenue. But it's not a bank that we can use as the general public. It's basically a bank to banks. Banks borrow money from the Federal Reserve. In exchange, the Federal Reserve charges them interest. If the Federal Reserve charges them low interest, then it's cheaper for the banks to borrow money, and they in turn will charge lower interest rates to the public when they borrow money from them. If the Federal Reserve, by contrast, raises interest rates, it makes it more expensive for the banks to borrow money, and they pass on that expense to the American public. In that way, the Federal Reserve can have an influence on interest rates, and through interest rates has an influence on the amount of money injected into the economy through banking activity. And so what Roosevelt basically says is, I want the Federal Reserve to make as much money available to these banks as possible so the banks have money to invest in the economy through loans. This is often called Roosevelt recapitalizing the banks, giving them money. And he's giving them government money. It comes with interest. They have to pay that back. but it's not it's not a high interest rate. Now, Roosevelt realizes that this is a short-term solution. Long-term, the banks have to be stable in their own right, which means they need to get deposits from people. But the problem is that people don't trust the banks because the banks had, in part, caused the Depression, and the banks had lost their money. And so Roosevelt needs to figure out a way to get people's confidence in the banks back. He needs to get confidence in the banks back. So how is he going to do that? Well, he's going to do that through a series of regulations. The most important of which you see here are the FDIC, the SEC, and the Glass-Steagall Act. The FDIC stands for the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation. What the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation does, and it still exists today, is it's a federal insurance program. It's an insurance program run by the federal government. Every bank that is a traditional bank is required to buy FDIC insurance, and they pay into it every year. That insurance then acts as a protection policy for the savings that are in the bank. If a bank should fail, if it should go under, if it's an FDIC bank, the government steps in and ensures that its savings accounts are covered, that no one loses their savings accounts up to a certain amount. So they cap it. But they ensure that basically everyone's savings are covered up to a certain point. This is meant to reassure people that the banks are safe, and they're safe not because the banks say so, but because the federal government says so, because of this insurance policy. The other thing that Roosevelt creates is the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission. The SEC is a group that investigates business practices, the stock market, financial laws, financial regulations, and makes sure that banks and corporations are obeying the law. This is meant to ensure that banks and corporations can't engage in misleading activities to the public or in activities that are meant to harm stockholders or harm the members of a bank and so on and so forth. It's a regulatory agency meant to ensure that business obeys the law and even can and also these laws can be added to over time. And then one of the most important things that Roosevelt does is the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act. This is a really important piece of legislation that establishes a really significant banking requirement. What Glass-Steagall was a law that forbid banks from engaging in risky behavior. So Glass-Steagall basically said there are two types of banks. There are traditional banks. These banks have savings accounts. They do home loans, car loans, business loans, etc. But they do not put their money in the stock market. And they do not put their money in the stock market because their money are everyday, average, ordinary people who just want to be able to do loans and have their money stored somewhere safe and earn an average interest rate on their money. The other bank, Glass-Steagall said, are the other kind of banks that this act said, there are investment banks. And these are banks that engage in activities like the stock market or bond markets or other kinds of investment, other kinds of risky behavior. And the Glass-Steagall legislation said, we recognize that that's important too. Both kinds of bankings are important and serve their function. So we want both kinds of banking to occur. But what we don't want is the same bank to do both those things. So basically they put a wall between traditional banks and investment banks. They said, if you're an investment bank, that's fine. You're an investment bank. Do what you want, but understand the risks you're taking. If you're a traditional bank, then you are engaged in traditional banking activity, home loans, business loans, car loans, savings, etc. But you can't cross over. FDIC insurance was only available to traditional banks. Investment banks couldn't get it because they were engaging in risky behavior. This was meant to basically prevent people from losing their savings and prevent banks with savings from engaging in risky activity that threatened their deposits and the economy as a whole. This act was really important, and just so you know, it was incredibly successful. It was incredibly successful. During the time that Glass-Steagall was in effect, the United States never faced an economic catastrophe like the Great Depression. Then Glass-Steagall was repealed in 2000. It was repealed by a Republican Congress and a Democratic president, Bill Clinton. Within 8 years of Glass-Steagall, we had another financial crisis in which there was an enormous recession caused in part by risky activity by banks. Many economists, many legal scholars believe that the repeal of Glass-Steagall encouraged banks to engage in risky activity that helped lead to the Great Recession of 2007, 8, 9, and so on and so forth. And many people argue that this piece of law needs to be reinstalled in order to better regulate and keep banks from engaging in risky activity that risks the economy as a whole. So far, it has not been reinstated. Roosevelt needed to also address agriculture. Agriculture was a major part of the American economy, and of course the Dust Bowl was causing economic crises across the country. And so Roosevelt passed through Congress the Agricultural Adjustment Act, also known as the AAA. The Agricultural Adjustment Act basically attempted to help farmers recover. It did so through two basic mechanisms. One was price control, and one was guaranteed prices. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act did is it identified essential agricultural activities and then decided the government would protect and sponsor those activities. Those activities were things like dairy and wheat and corn and beef and hogs and cotton and tobacco. And in order to make sure that those farmers were protected, they did a couple of things. In some cases, they wanted to ensure that farmers would get a healthy price for their commodity. And so in order to ensure that farmers got a healthy price for their commodity, what it is they produced, they would often pay farmers not to farm. Now that might seem strange to you, but if you think about wheat or corn, one of the problems there is that wheat can be stored as flour, corn can be stored in dried form for a very, very long time. So every year that crop can be stored. And that means that supply is being added. And the more supply you have, the less the price is. Because the greater quantity of something you have, typically it's worth less. And so in order to make sure that crops achieved a certain amount of a certain price, oftentimes the government decided under the Agricultural Adjustment Act to pay farmers not to farm, to leave their fields fallow. Part of this was to reduce supply, which would raise prices, but part of this was meant to address environmental concerns, to allow land to be lay fallow, and to allow grasses to return or vegetation to return to land, to ensure that the topsoil got locked in, or to ensure that the soil didn't get over-farmed. And so part of this was about protecting the farmland itself, but a lot of it was just about regulating price through regulating supply, trying to reduce supply. Now that approach can work for things like corn or cotton or wheat, right? Because those things are storable. But this doesn't work for perishable goods, for goods that will go bad, like your dairy products. And for those kinds of goods, right, what the government did is they identified what price the farmer needed to turn a profit. And then they made sure the farmer got that price. Now, if the farmer got that price on the market, let's say the price per gallon of milk was either at or above the price that the federal government had determined was what the farmer needed to make a living. Well, then the government did nothing. But if the price of a gallon of milk dropped below that price that the government had identified was necessary for the farmer to make a living, the federal government would come in and give the farmer a check to make up the difference. So let's just use a hypothetical here. Let's say that milk was $1.50 a gallon on the open market. And that the federal government had determined that the farmer needed $1.75 to make a living. Well, then the government would give the farmer a check for 25 cents for every gallon that the farmer produced. Why? Because the market had determined the price was lower than the price the farmer needed to make a living. And the government stepped in and made up the difference. By contrast, if the price of milk was $2 a gallon, then the government did nothing because the farmer was getting 25 cents more. It was a pretty revolutionary attempt to ensure that food production remained in spite of the challenges of the market. And it was a major, major government program investing in this. It is a pretty radical solution. And just so you know, ever since the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the government has done these types of price controls and payments for either fallow land or for dairy or a whole host of other industries ever since. This is not something we've stopped doing. We've been doing it ever since. Not exactly in the same way, but ever since. Perhaps the New Deal was its most radical when dealing with industry. Roosevelt invested heavy resources and legislation into trying to get America's industrial economy turned around and trying to improve America's industrial recovery. Its main piece of legislation was what was called the National Recovery Administration, often known as the NRA. The National Recovery Administration was a government entity, agency, invested with the responsibility for identifying where government could most improve industry, specifically in granting government contracts to businesses for government production. So the idea here was government contracts. The government would pay businesses money to produce certain things or to do certain kinds of work. And in the Depression, where businesses, particularly factories and mines and logging mills and so on and so forth, they were desperate for work. These government contracts were essential. And so these were really important contracts, and the Roosevelt administration utilized them to try and get businesses going and get workers back to work. Now, as part of the National Recovery Industry, you had a subgroup created called the PWA, the Public Works Administration. One of the major things that the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal are going to do is invest heavy in the nation's infrastructure, in public works. They are going to invest heavily in trying to improve America's infrastructure. The Public Works Act identified public works projects that need to be done for the benefit of America. And this was seen as like killing two birds with one stone, if you will. On the one hand, you're putting money in businesses and in workers because you're giving government contracts to businesses. And then those businesses have to hire workers, and you're paying them a wage, and that wage becomes the way they can make a living, and they can spend that money on things in the economy. So this is seen as pumping money into the economy, while at the same time ensuring that we have a better infrastructure at the end of it. Ensuring we have a better infrastructure at the end of it. And so one of the things the Public Works Administration did was heavily invested in dam projects in the Pacific Northwest, for instance. Grand Coulee Dam, Bonneville Dam. And Grand Coulee Dam is still the biggest dam in the United States. At the time, it was the biggest dam in the world on the Columbia River. Bonneville Dam was a big program. And these dams were built to generate hydroelectricity and bring irrigation water to desert environments in places like eastern Washington and eastern Oregon and parts of Idaho. And so this was seen as achieving multiple outcomes. Because on the one hand, you're putting people to work and you're putting money in the hands of businesses and manufacturers. Steel, concrete, so on and so forth, all needs to be created in order to build these dams. And then you're putting workers to work. But at the end of this, you have a brand new infrastructure. And one of the things you need to understand is the PWA invents the idea of a public utility. And not everywhere in the country has public utilities, but many places do. Public utilities are places where the public owns the utility through the government. Without the investment of the PWA, many places in the country never would have had electricity. By the 1930s, there's lots of places in the country that have electricity. Places like New York and Chicago have electricity. New York was known as the city that never slept because it had lights everywhere. It was a glittering, lit, illuminated city, as was Detroit, as was Chicago, as was Pittsburgh. By contrast, if you went out into the rural South or rural West, these people were still using candles and oil lanterns. Electricity was unheard of in most rural areas. Why? Because electricity was done by private properties who created dams and other means of generating electricity, and then they sold that electricity at a profit to places. And since there wasn't any profit in rural America, because there weren't enough people, it wasn't worth the investment. The PWA changed that. It rewrote the infrastructure of the United States that made possible economic growth, the victory in war in World War II, and set the United States up on the path that it was on throughout most of the 20th century. It was a very, very consequential amount, a piece of legislation, a program. And it was all based on the idea of government contracts. The government would pay for certain resources, for certain economic activity, for certain products. And the government decided instead of just paying for random stuff, let's pay for stuff that improves the country. It's a pretty revolutionary idea. Now, part of this, beginning in 1935, was anyone who accepted a government contract had to obey the criteria of what was known as the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act. What the Wagner Act was a requirement by private companies that if their workers wanted to unionize, they had to let them. And once the union was organized, they had to deal directly with the union in collective bargaining for contracts that related to wages, hours, working conditions, healthcare, pensions, so on and so forth. This is a really important deal because private companies, private businesses, as we have seen, resisted, fought, tried to prevent unions from forming. And now here's the government with the Wagner Act saying, you have to allow this to happen. And specifically, you have to allow this to happen if you're going to take government contracts. These government contracts all came with strings. You had to pay union wages. You had to do a 40-hour work week. You had to meet a certain safety standards. You had to make certain hourly standards and certain, so many days off. What the New Deal programs in industry and in manufacturing were huge, huge wins for unions. Because under Roosevelt, unions got a lot of what they had been clamoring for, protesting for, demanding, going back to the 19th century. And the Wagner Act was sort of the cherry on top. It meant that unions could organize, and it was illegal for businesses to stop them from doing so. Roosevelt also invested heavily in our public lands. He invested in conservation in national parks that were existing, like he conserved them and preserved them as natural wonders in existing national parks. Roosevelt will also create new national parks. Perhaps his most famous program in perhaps his most famous program with respect to public lands was what's known as the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This was a government group that built bridges, built museums, interpretive centers, trails, camping areas, bathrooms in national parks. They developed America's public land for the public to enjoy. The national parks that you can visit today with visitor centers, camping sites, observatories, museums, roads, all the infrastructure exists in national parks. That's a legacy of Roosevelt's New Deal investment of the Civilian Conservation Corps. The idea was we have this public land, let's pay people to make the public land accessible to the public as a whole. So this put people to work, and it put people to work in a way that gave Americans greater access and appreciation to the national parks. There were other infrastructure programs that the Roosevelt administration engaged in, like the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built dams and electrical facilities in the American South to bring electricity to rural areas. And and while this mostly benefited white communities, black communities benefited in the South from this as well. There was the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. One of their advertising flyers is the opening to this slide. The WPA was involved in public works and other public building projects. They built roads, bridges, schools. The New Deal did everything it could to invest heavily in the nation's infrastructure. One of the last New Deal programs was Social Security. One of the things that Roosevelt realized is that we needed to find a way to allow older Americans to move out of the economy and retire and make way for new workers in the economy, for younger workers. But you could only do that if they had some sort of financial security. And the Social Security program was the solution to that. Social Security was introduced in 1938. The idea was to provide that every worker would pay into the system, and then those workers the money those workers paid into the system would provide the ability for workers who reached a certain age to retire and receive monthly income, or for workers who were injured or unable to work. They would end up with payments, right? What we today call disability payments. The Social Security program was a really important program and a pretty revolutionary program of the New Deal. Now, the New Deal was incredibly popular with the American public. Roosevelt himself was extremely popular with the American public. He was elected with a wide majority in 1932. He won again in 36 in a landslide, and his party increased their majorities in the House and the Senate. However, Roosevelt's agenda often ran into trouble in the courts. The New Deal was a revolutionary program. The New Deal involved the government in all sorts of activities that it had never been involved in before. And among critics of the New Deal, it raised the question whether or not the New Deal programs, the kind of spending, regulation, price controls and all the kinds of programs that the New Deal engaged in, it begged the question whether or not those programs were constitutional. Now, Congress had said that these programs were constitutional under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And the Commerce Clause of the Constitution is a part of Article 1 that gives the federal government the right to regulate interstate commerce. It gives the government the right to regulate interstate commerce. And since the American economy involves economic activity that crosses lines, Congress argued we have the right to do these programs. However, many people challenged these laws in federal court. And some of these cases made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And one of the things that happened is during Roosevelt's first term, many of the New Deal programs were struck down as unconstitutional. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was struck down as unconstitutional. The National Recovery Administration was struck down as unconstitutional. And so the court said that these programs were unconstitutional. Roosevelt was furious. Roosevelt was furious. He was furious that his agenda was being stymied by the courts. After winning a landslide election in 1936 and seeing more of his agenda potentially being struck down, Roosevelt decided that he had a solution to dealing with the courts. And that solution was not trying to craft legislation that the court would consider acceptable. It was simply changing the composition of the court. So if you recall, the Supreme Court is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, but then they have lifetime appointments unless they're impeached. They're lifetime appointments. Presidents almost always inherit courts that have individuals on them appointed by their predecessors. The court never reflects the president that was just elected. It reflects presidents from many years past, sometimes multiple administrations past. And the court that Roosevelt inherited was filled with traditional Republican appointees who were philosophically opposed to the New Deal and were very eager to strike it down. Roosevelt believed that that was unfair. And so Roosevelt proposed a piece of legislation called the Judicial Procedure Reform Bill. The Judicial Procedures Reform Bill was designed to add members to the court. This is sometimes called court packing, because Roosevelt was going to add members to the court. He was going to add enough members to the court that the composition of the court would change. And so when the New Deal legislation came up, the majority of justices would be Roosevelt appointees, and in theory would agree with him and say that the New Deal was constitutional. So he's going to change the composition of the court because he didn't like the decisions the courts were making. In some historians' telling of this, this was a dangerous attack on the norms that govern America. That Roosevelt was trying to change the composition of a co-equal branch of government, the courts, because he didn't like the outcome of the courts. And this was seen as dangerous for American democracy by these commentators because Roosevelt was trying to change the courts. He was trying to change the courts because he didn't like that they were a check on him and his agenda. And so there was critics at the time, and there's a school of historians now that say that Roosevelt was engaging in dangerous activity by attacking the independence and autonomy of a co-equal constitutional branch of government. However, there are other ways to look at this. And I'm not saying which way is right or which way is wrong. I'm just saying there are other ways to look at this. And historians and scholars and people at the time had also pointed out a different viewpoint of this. And the different viewpoint of this is that Roosevelt was elected twice with large majorities. His party was elected twice with large majorities in Congress. The people had spoken widely and decisively for Roosevelt's vision of America, and the Supreme Court was striking it down. The Supreme Court was saying, no, it's wrong. And of course, the Supreme Court is the unelected branch of government. No one elects a Supreme Court justice. Supreme Court justices are appointed, confirmed, and serve lifetime appointments. So one could argue, and many critics at the time did, and many historians today argue, that Roosevelt wasn't attacking the autonomy of a branch of government. He was attacking an anti-democratic institution, an institution that was refusing to acknowledge the will of the people and popular opinion. And popular opinion was with Roosevelt. And what right did an unelected bunch of judges have to impose their view of America on the elected branches of government? I am not suggesting that there's a right or a wrong here. I'm not suggesting there's a simple solution here. What I am saying is there are multiple ways to look at this incident, and in doing so, you see one of the great dilemmas of American democracy and of the American political system, which is the courts were within their power to strike these laws down. The question is, should they have? Should they have? Their striking down of these laws was based on their own opinion, not necessarily on a universally agreed upon principle that the New Deal programs violated the Commerce Clause. Instead, it was based on their particular interpretation that the New Deal programs had no basis in the Constitution, and thus they struck them down. But of course, they weren't elected. And the people supported this overwhelmingly through their votes in multiple elections, 1932, 1934, 1936. And you could argue that it was the court that was engaging in activity that was never envisioned by the framers of the Constitution in standing in the way of the will of the people and the democratic process. This episode in which Roosevelt was engaged in a bitter political and legal struggle with the courts over the future of the New Deal reveals the tensions within the American system and the ways in which both sides could make the case that the other was wrong in interpreting the constitutional mandate and political will of the people. Roosevelt's Judicial Procedures Reform Bill made even his own party nervous, and it didn't pass Congress. So Roosevelt was unable to reconstitute the court in a way that more to his liking. But the court was deeply disturbed and intimidated by this action. And as a consequence, the court began to back down. The Roosevelt administration passed most of the New Deal laws that the Supreme Court struck down again after 1936. And when those laws came before the court in later years, in 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, etc., the court said this time round they were constitutional. It's a pretty quick about face. It's a pretty quick reversal of opinion. And if you read their rationale for why, it's not very convincing. Roosevelt, in the long term, won this battle. The court had seen what Roosevelt might do if it continued to strike down if the court continued to strike down the New Deal. They had seen how far Roosevelt was willing to go to ensure that these bills became a lasting part of American law, and they simply bowed to the political pressure of Roosevelt. The last thing we want to do in this lecture is talk about the New Deal with respect to race and gender. Because the New Deal affected every American, but it didn't affect every American the same. One of the things you need to know is that the Roosevelt administration contained very progressive voices in its administration on racial and gender equality. The two most prominent were Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, but she was an inordinately active First Lady. She was the most political First Lady in American history to this point, and possibly of all time. Eleanor Roosevelt was deeply sympathetic to issues of gender equality, and she was deeply engaged in issues of gender equality, and she was deeply interested in racial equality. She was sympathetic to African Americans and disliked and was an opponent of the Jim Crow system and of the violence that targeted African Americans. The same was true for one of Roosevelt's most trusted advisors, his Secretary of Interior, Harold Ikes. Ikes was also a leading progressive voice on racial and gender issues. And it's true that the Roosevelt administration hired African Americans to work in the federal government in numbers that no other administration had before. And it had women in important roles. For instance, a woman was Secretary of Labor, a high-ranking cabinet position. And women and African Americans do benefit from New Deal programs. The New Deal programs that helped put people back to work, or the infrastructure programs, or the resources, or the opportunities that the New Deal provided, do impact Black Americans and women as a whole. However, the institutional racism that defined America hampered the New Deal as well. In the South, New Deal programs were allowed to be segregated. New Deal programs were allowed to be segregated in the South. And African Americans were paid lower wages for doing work on New Deal programs in the American South. Additionally, when Social Security was rolled out, many African Americans and women were exempted from the benefits of Social Security. How this worked is when Social Security was rolled out, it originally exempted farm workers, so farm workers weren't entitled to Social Security, and people involved in domestic service. So people who were like maids and nannies and so on and so forth. Well, a large number of African Americans were engaged in agricultural work, and a large number of women were engaged in the service industry. And as a consequence of that, they weren't eligible for Social Security. So originally Social Security did not include them. And this was not an oversight. This was not something that was an oversight. This was not done because they simply did not think about agricultural workers or service workers. This was done because white Democrats in the South, and remember, Southern Democrats who are segregationists, they're often called Dixiecrats. Southern Democrats were a huge part of the Democratic coalition. Roosevelt needs their votes to get this legislation through. Roosevelt needs these votes to get this legislation through. And so he has to make political compromises. And he was willing to compromise the benefits of farm workers and women in Social Security in exchange for getting it for everyone else. Additionally, Franklin Roosevelt refused to sign legislation banning lynchings. There was widespread support among Northern Republicans and Northern Democrats for banning lynchings and to eliminate poll taxes in the South, which was a major way that African Americans were disenfranchised. But Roosevelt refused to sign that legislation because he was worried that he would lose the political support of Southern Democrats if he did so. So, as a consequence, right, of this, what you see is the New Deal often perpetuated racism and racial inequality and gender inequality in some profound ways. That said, a political movement began to emerge in the North among African Americans who found themselves benefiting from the New Deal in ways that were pretty profound. And because of that, they began to switch their political alliance to Democrats. This is the start of a process that will be progressing throughout the 20th century, which is that Democrats will start to gain the support of African Americans. It's just in its infancy right now. It's just in its infancy. But as we progress to the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, African Americans are going to switch their political loyalties from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. And its birth really is beginning here with the New Deal, and Northern African Americans find that they benefit from the New Deal programs. The other thing I want you to be aware of is that Native Americans benefited from the New Deal. In fact, they got their own New Deal. In 1934, Congress passed and Roosevelt signed the Indian Reorganization Act, often known as the Indian New Deal. The Indian New Deal put an end to the era of allotment and assimilation. It put an end to the era of allotment and assimilation in which Native Americans found their land being divided up into allotments and forced to assimilate through Indian schools. The Indian New Deal put an end to that and immediately began to turn the reservations back over in more fully, not entirely, but more fully to Native American tribes. And it ended the process of forced boarding schools, although the boarding schools don't exactly end overnight. So Native Americans got more control and autonomy over their reservations, which they had been lacking for a very long time. And they saw an end to a policy that had nearly wiped out their culture. However, many Native American groups found themselves marginalized by the some of the other parts of the New Deal. For instance, Native American groups in the Pacific Northwest found their traditional hunting and fishing grounds destroyed because of the dam projects. So a lot of the infrastructure projects in the United States happen on reservation land or impacted reservation land that really hurt traditional Native American lifestyles. And so the Indian Reorganization Act was a huge benefit for Native Americans, but some of the other New Deal programs destroyed in their, as sort of collateral damage, Native American traditions, Native American lifestyles. As I mentioned before, the New Deal also addressed environmental concerns like erosion and habitat loss, and addressed issues of conservation. It also helped. It also played a role in what's known as the Okie migration, in which Southerners and people from the Great Plains moved out west. The New Deal often encouraged that movement because they came and worked in New Deal programs. All right. There is your look at the New Deal. The New Deal is infinitely more complicated than what we were able to cover in this lecture, but this gives you at least the basis for looking at the programs, the perspective, and what it was the Roosevelt administration was trying to achieve. In the next lectures, we'll talk about World War II. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.